Welcome back everyone. So as most of you know, I just review a bunch of older technology, and so far I think I've reviewed most of the modern MacBooks, and with the new M1 MacBooks that came out, I've been using the M1 MacBook Pro for a while, but the first MacBook that I ever bought, that I ever used, was actually I think in 2016 when I bought it, which was the 2014 Retina MacBook Pro, the 13-inch model, and I can tell you I had the best experience of all time with this specific MacBook. I don't know what it was. I stopped using it I think sometime in 2018 or 2017 when I updated to a 2015 13-inch MacBook, and I can tell you this MacBook for sure was a solid MacBook that even if you're still using it now in 2021, depending on what you're using it for, is still probably going to net you an overall positive experience. I think you're going to love it. Now, this is what I'll tell you. First of all, this MacBook came out in two different sizes. So it came out in that 13-inch model and that 15-inch model. Right now, I think that's very important to say because right now we do only have that 13-inch model and 16-inch model. There's no longer a 15-inch model, but for these M1 MacBooks, there's only the 13-inch models and then essentially the M1 Mac Mini. So the ranges are much more crazier now, but back then in 2014, this MacBook and that 15-inch MacBook, really the main differences were that the 15-inch MacBook had the bigger display, essentially potentially better battery life on some models, I guess from what I've heard, and it's a better, faster performing MacBook as well. But this MacBook, the 13-inch one, as I mentioned, I had a solid experience with. First of all, this was a very, very premium feeling MacBook, and it still feels premium. You can still pick up like a 2009 MacBook Pro, and it can still feel so premium. I have a 2012 Retina MacBook Pro, the first one, and it still feels so good. Like, it's crazy how Apple does these things. It just lasts so long because it feels so good, and this MacBook is no exception. Now, even within the 13-inch models and 15-inch models, there were a couple of differences for sure, but there are still some things that I wish the newer M1 MacBook Pro, like I wish my M1 MacBook Pro had, that my 2014 MacBook Pro actually ended up having. So first of all, the port selection. The ports on this thing are crazy still. First of all, we have that MagSafe capability. We no longer have MagSafe except for our iPhones, and that's something that's really sad. With these MacBooks, I loved having that type of capability. It was so awesome. We were able to just plug it in. If I tripped over it or whatever, it would go ahead and unplug. Now I have to be extremely careful. I have to kind of exactly put it in exactly how it is, and it's just kind of annoying. With this MacBook, that was not the case. I just slid it in and it was fine. You had two Thunderbolt 2 ports, which I pretty much used to dock up to a display with the HDMI connector, and pretty much all displays were compatible with it, which was cool. You had that USB port on the left and also a headphone jack on the left as well. And when you flip it over to the other side, this is where you ended up having that SD card. This is the one thing I wish my MacBook had. By not having an SD card, it really makes me upset because I'm like, man, I have to bring a dongle with me everywhere. I use a dongle for one thing, for an SD card. Everything else I can pretty much use USB-C with, but I really miss that, and apparently the next MacBooks are bringing it, but I don't have the next MacBook right now, so I have to complain about it. We have that HDMI port, full HDMI port too. This is another really awesome thing. I don't really care too much though if Apple brings it with the next MacBooks, but this MacBook has it, which is cool. And then you have another USB 3 port on that side as well. Now, I remember when I bought this MacBook, one of the biggest complaints was that it didn't have a CD slot. But another thing was that it didn't have as many ports as that 2012 MacBook Pro, the non-standard, not Retina one. And that was something that was very surprising because now when I think about it, it's like, wow, I wish, we're going into a no ports again. So I wonder if in a couple years, our MacBooks are going to have even less ports than they do now. Who knows? Maybe they'll get rid of the headphone jack. I'm not really too sure, but I guess we'll see what happens. Now, there were a couple other advantages with this type of MacBook. There were some things that you can actually upgrade internally. Now, it wasn't super crazy. It wasn't like you can go and change everything about it like the 2012 MacBook Pro, but this MacBook still had some things that you can change with it. Me personally, I never changed it, but I know you can change things like the battery. You can change things like, I think the storage and possibly even the RAM. There are not a crazy amount of things you can do, but there's still some functionality that you can do. Then you can upgrade yourself without necessarily having to go and upgrade to a 2020, M1 MacBook Pro or something. And I would highly recommend you guys to look into it if you guys want to. Now, flipping this thing open, that's when you get this beautiful display, either the 13-inch model or 15-inch model. They're both extremely beautiful, and they are solid displays for sure. Are they perfect? Honestly, probably. I don't really see any big difference between this one and the other ones. Like, they're almost all exactly the same. I think the 13-inch model, for me, I don't know, probably had a better looking display. I own the 15-inch 2015 MacBook Pro, and I kind of still like my 13 13-inch one, I think it looks better. Now you do have pretty thick bezels all around the display, but it's really not that bad. The 13-inch MacBook I'm looking into right now is kind of like the same thing, but also like when you look at the 16-inch MacBook, that thing looks so better, so much better than all these other MacBooks, to be honest. But this display looks beautiful still. You have that full-size keyboard, which actually takes those full-size keys, which is awesome. And on top of that, you have that trackpad, which still is functional, still looks great. Now, this one doesn't have that, force touch technology, so it is a physical button that clicks down. So keep that in mind. Apple didn't switch that over till the 2015 MacBooks, but as I mentioned before, I still think it's totally okay, and it still feels extremely good. Now, that covers up everything in terms of a body standpoint. I think that is the biggest differentiating factor from these older MacBooks and these newer ones, is the body type that changed. Internally, we are already expecting this MacBook to be slower. It's not going to last as long as other MacBooks, but the body is one of those things that has to be hit on. Now, I will tell you, performance-wise, when I was using it in 2016, probably I think up until like 2017, I had a great experience. I never complained about the performance. I had a 128 gig model with I think 8 gigs of RAM at the time, and it was perfectly fine. I was not complaining at all, even about the storage. I edited a ton of videos on this thing. I think the first like couple hundred videos I edited on this thing, I never complained about it once. It was great. I eventually switched up to that 2015 MacBook Pro, and I honestly didn't even see it being that much faster. I think the 15-inch one was actually much faster though, but this one, with it having 8 gigs of RAM, it was fine for me for doing things like, making music and using Logic Pro for editing videos in Final Cut Pro. The export times definitely were slow. They weren't anything like my M1 MacBook right now, but it was good enough for the most part. And if I had to do any work for school or anything like that, I'd be able to do it. And it was so small for me at the time that I can go ahead and throw it in a book bag or carry it around wherever, and it was a solid experience. Again, if you're looking at something like, an M1 MacBook compared to this thing, the M1 MacBook is going to have way more functionality on it. It's going to have way more features, and it's going to be extremely faster. But for the price tag, I'm sure you can pick up a 2014 Retina MacBook Pro for probably, I want to say like $500, maybe even less than that. And that is less than half the cost of the M1 MacBook. And you're really not missing out on that much. Like, there's definitely more functionality on that MacBook, but you're not missing out on a crazy ton. Now, on top of that, and to give you guys more perspective, I was using my 15-inch 2015 MacBook Pro up until like 2 months ago when I switched to the M1 MacBook. And like I mentioned before, from my 2014 to 2015, there really wasn't that big of a difference, to be completely honest. Now, like I mentioned, if you need more performance, getting that 15-inch MacBook is probably the better choice to go. It's going to get you better performance. It's going to get you, I guess, more RAM in some models as well. But I still think the 13-inch is a really good model. But either or, a humongous thing I also have to say is the longevity of it. The software, the hardware is definitely going to outlast the software in my opinion. Right now, the 2012 Retina MacBook Pro just got unsupported, so it did not get macOS Big Sur. The 2013 one ended up getting macOS Big Sur, so that makes me think that Apple's probably going to axe the 2013 one for the next version of macOS, and then essentially the 2014 one is going to get one more year of extra updates, and it may get security updates here and there, but this thing is coming up to its last leg. It's not going to be lasting like another 5 years in software, which I think is expected. It had a pretty good lifespan, and I think it's totally okay for the most part. So keep that in mind. I think everything else is totally okay with it, but the software is one of those things that's going to be outdated probably within the next 2 years. So keep that in mind. I think everything else about this MacBook is still in check, but if you don't care about the software, then this thing can last you for as long as the performance seems fine. I didn't even update my MacBook. Like when I bought it in 2016, I think it still had like one version of macOS old on it. Like it was like 1 year behind, and I never updated it because it was just so perfect to me that I was like, I don't want to update it. I don't want to mess it up. And I ended up not doing it. And I think I resold it, and it ended up having the same software that I bought it at like a year before, so which was already a year old at that point. So I can definitely tell you, I think it's totally okay if you don't want to update or whatever. But I think ultimately the 2014 MacBook Pro, whether the 15-inch or 13-inch one, are solid contenders still in 2021. I don't think, they're the first ones I would recommend. At least I would recommend a 2015 one, but I used the 2014 one for a while and I enjoyed it. I bought it used and I loved it, and I'm probably sure that you will probably end up loving it too. So that pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count. So me so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.